You're listening to the Talent Therapy Podcast. Here, you'll find discussions around recruiting trends and best practices with talent acquisition leaders in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries so that you and your team are informed and up to date in an ever-evolving space. And now, here's your host, Chris Tamburini.
All right, Mr. Mike Conway, welcome to the Talent Therapy Podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here.
Great. Well, Mike, as usual, I would like to start off this conversation the way that I start most conversations on this podcast. And I'd love for you to give an introduction to yourself to the audience.
Perfect. Yeah. So Mike Conway, I head up talent at BlueRock Therapeutics. I've been there for just about 2 years now. During that time, we've gone from a 170 person preclinical organization to a 440 person true R&D mid-sized biotech. So it's been a wild ride, you could say, over the past 2 years.
Yeah, that's some pretty substantial growth. You know, I'd be curious, I think the audience would be curious to hear how you ended up in recruiting, and then even more specifically, how you ended up in biotech. I'd love to hear about your journey and your pathway to where you are today.
So it's funny, I don't think when I've asked anyone that question that they said, in high school, I wanted to be a recruiter when I grew up.
Never.
I also fit that bill. So I went to Boston University. I'm originally from New Jersey. Don't hold that against me. And when I came up here, I was pre-med, and studied human physiology. I've always been interested in medical, but didn't have the grades to get into med school. So I come from a family of teachers. So I was really searching for a job after after I graduated, and I got a high school teaching job at Boston Public Schools. So I taught anatomy and physiology for 2 years, my first job out of college, which was wild. And, really, I wasn't sure what I wanted to, quote unquote, be when I grew up. So I took a summer job as a recruiter, and I was recruiting for door-to-door solar energy salesman. And that was the first thing I recruited for. I was there for a decent amount of time, but I kept looking at, folks' backgrounds in recruiting, and like, well, how do I get to that? How do I, kind of grow my career? And everybody had agency experience. So, I left the recruiting for door-to-door salesman, and I was in agency for a minute. And that definitely allowed me to cut my teeth. And after that, I went into consumer goods. So I was at Keurig for a bit. I was at Sam Adams for a bit, Shark Ninja for a while. And, that's really where I kind of fell in love with recruiting. And I'm like, okay, this is something I can make a career out of. And, I've had the pleasure of working with some really great people, and, they've been able to get me into some opportunities that I don't know I would have been able to get into by myself. And I was at a job, and we were building out this center of excellence for basically a portfolio company when COVID hit. And that was really a kind of aha moment for me of, am I passionate about the roles I'm recruiting for? Am I aligned to the mission of the organization that I'm working for? And it really kind of pushed me into looking into biotech. And there was always this predisposition for me that, if you didn't know somebody in biotech, or if you weren't in already, there was no getting in. And Bluebird actually took a chance on me, with no biotech experience, to come in and help run their recruiting programs. And, really the rest is history. I don't see, knock on wood, really ever leaving this industry again.
That's great. That story is, everyone has a very specific and interesting pathway. And I don't think there's one person that I've ever spoken with, not just on this podcast, but in general, that ended up in recruiting, let alone biotech recruiting, on purpose. It almost never happens.
Well, that's why recruiting is such a funny profession, where, you don't go and study something and, get a certificate of like, okay, you are proficient in recruiting. But that, for any recruiters listening, that's also kind of the double-edged sword that hiring managers think it's really easy and they don't
Yeah.
understand how it could possibly be hard. People apply, you screen out the good or the bad ones, you hire the good ones. On paper, our job sounds really, really easy.
On paper, you're right. It does. It looks very simple. And I think logistically, it can be simple, but you take it a layer deeper and it's extremely dynamic and you're working with an infinite amount of variables.
100%. Gotta love the people business.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like we're just screening widgets. You're talking to a human being who has an entire life and an entire set of aspirations and all these factors that you don't know about yet, but you'll eventually learn about them throughout the recruiting process.
Absolutely. And that's, when I'm recruiting recruiters, that's the one thing that I really kind of hammer on to really vet is, can you go find people? Great. Do you have kind of the technical competency to be able to source and do those kind of things? Sure, that's really important. But, are you proactive and are you empathetic? Like those are the two things that I really need to lean in on because to your point, there are so many variables that you're grappling with that you might be talking to somebody that's absolutely fantastic, but it's not the right fit. And it's
Yeah,
your job as the recruiter to be that talent broker that you have enough confidence to say no to a hiring manager that we're not hiring this person and here's why. And they might be perfect, but just not for right now.
that's right. I mean, some of the best technical candidates that I've had and worked with aren't the best fits for the role ultimately because of other factors. And those factors, the list is very long. So, that actually is a really good segue into one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, Mike. And that's really, what your style is and what you've learned along the way when it comes to how to most accurately interview and ultimately place people into your specific organization, into your specific culture at BlueRock or anywhere that you've worked. And so one of the things you and I, when we met for a drink a couple months back, was this topic that you brought up that struck a chord with me. And I think innately it's something that I've done, and I think innately it's something that other recruiters have done, but it's something that you have consciously and intentionally made part of your process, which I specifically found fascinating. And that was values based interviewing. And so I would love to hear your perspective on your general interviewing style and how you've come up with a method of values based interviewing and ultimately how that's benefited you and ultimately your entire organization.
No, absolutely. It's something I'm really, really proud of. But again, I don't think I'm recreating the wheel here. I think most recruiters or folks in talent acquisition, they're doing this. It just might not be as templatized as we have it at BlueRock. So
That's right.
I think it all starts honestly with a mentor that I had, Bree Miller, and she said the only way you can be effective in talent acquisition in-house is if you are an embedded business partner. So you understand the business functions that you are supporting. And it's not just from a technical competency perspective. It is who are they? What are their motivators? I want to steer away from, the quote unquote culture, but actually focus on the values because culture inherently has some bias in it. Like I tell hiring managers in intake meetings, like honestly, I don't really care if you want to go have a beer with this person after work. I care about, does this person care about what we care about, right? Are they going to be dedicated to the mission of the organization? And the mission here at BlueRock is how do we get therapies to patients faster, right? So there's this freedom to fail. There's this inherent cohesion cross-functionally, and that's what we need to vet. Is a technical mastery necessary? Of course. So really, when I started, the landscape for interviewing is probably going to sound pretty familiar to other people. It was very, very large interview teams, probably north of 8 or 9. And there was no real structure around the conversations themselves. You would have, a resume, and in the absence of structure, a non-recruiter is going to lean on kind of what's easy to make out of an awkward conversation, and that's walk me through your resume. And once you start to do that, and then you go to a debrief, if it exists, everybody has the exact same story that candidate delivered, right? There's that every candidate has that one nugget story that, like, wow, I have to share that in the interview. And if your interviewers aren't asking, different questions or trying to probe at different things, they're all going to come with the same story to the debrief, and it's not going to be this robust conversation. Really, what you're going to get out of that is, was the candidate likable? So there's going to be likability bias, but it's also going to be a very siloed conversation of, can they get this job, the one job that they're interviewing for, or won't they? Right? There's no talent community. There's no kind of longevity. But also think about the candidate experience, right? If I'm giving up time, if it's, say they're employed, say they're unemployed, it doesn't really matter. You're giving up your time, and you're going to have 8 or 9 or 10 of the exact same conversations. Why would I want to work for that company at the end of that process? So after kind of going on a listening tour starting, it was really centered around, how do we differentiate ourselves in the market, right? You throw a rock in Kendall Square, you'll hit 5 or 10 cell gene companies. So saying that we have the best people and the best science isn't really going to differentiate ourselves. It's really how we treat the candidate. So we had these organizational values that we put up on our company website, and it just made sense. There were 4 company values. And I don't know really why, I have no data to support this, like my perfect interview size is 5 people, right? You'll have the hiring manager and then 4 additional interviewers, hopefully from a cross-functional standpoint. So the hiring manager, they focus on technical mastery. Nobody should be able to know what the need is and who's going to be able to do that need better than the hiring manager. So that's step 1 after screening with the recruiter. The next 4 conversations, each interviewer has a different value that they're assigned to interview against. So what we've done is we've put together a template of stock questions for each interview, value focus. Those are delivered to the interviewers before we even tell the candidate what that particular interviewer is going to be focused on. So they're prepared. So the conversation itself is much more fruitful. It's not coming out of left field that somebody's talking about integrity or courage or urgency. But what that allows for then are 4, 5 actually very differentiated conversations. You come back to the debrief, and everybody's now pulling on a much more vast toolkit of, little tidbits that this candidate drops. And now we have a much clearer picture of who this candidate is, what their motivators are, the experiences that they have, so that if the answer is no for this particular role, we have far more robust notes to think about if another role comes down the pipe, or where the potential transferable skills are as we continue to scale. So it was the perfect storm of needing to make our interview process more succinct and efficient. We were scaling at the time. We were trying to establish a talent brand. And now that those things are established, our time to hire is down 2 weeks from where it was a year ago. Our acceptance rate of offer is up by 10%. Like, the data is now starting to suggest that, one, it's working, the candidate experience is there, but also where we had some pushback on the front end from hiring managers of, this feels a little bit, quote unquote, big pharma, or this is too rigorous, this is too process. Now they're enjoying it, because once you put that process in and there's repeatability, you get better. Interviewing is a skill. Yeah. And if you practice the same way and you continue to do something the same way, you're going to get better at it.
Wow. There's a lot there. I'm really intrigued by the entire emphasis on values. And so I do think in our industry, and I'm not going to use the word guilty. Well, I am going to use the word guilty. I'm guilty of talking to, and I think a lot of people are, a lot of recruiters are, you talk to a candidate, you get a technical and a logistical evaluation of some of the things they've done. You look for examples. you you evaluate their communication skills, and you use your gut, right?
Yep.
That is, it works, but it could be better, right? And I think what you're getting into is a way that you can use all of those things that I just said to make it a repeatable, more robust process. And then you actually have some data to support the results. So I want to take this a level deeper, and I'm really curious, how do you evaluate an interview for a value, right? A value is something that is entrenched in somebody, and getting them to display that in an interview seems like it could be pretty difficult. So I want to kind of hear your perspective and what your strategy has been to determine the values of that individual, and then what you do with that information as a hiring team.
No, absolutely. So I think the really important thing here is that we don't go into the conversations with a predisposition of what those values look like. It's really about how do these values show up for this particular person. So what that hopefully allows for is diversity of thought. We don't want everybody in the company to think about community the same way. We don't want everybody to think about urgency. So our values themselves are community, integrity, urgency, and courage. So the way that we've really structured the question is leaning on past experience. I am a huge believer that past experience is an indicator of future performance. And when we go through these interview trainings to prepare, everybody has to go through a full interview training before they're allowed to interview in the organization. We, I have a million one-liners, but one of them is stay out of the woods, right? I don't want you to ask a question of what would you do, because then we get into the theoretical, and everyone's going to have the best answer if you're in the theoretical. I want to know, what did you do when things were stressful? Why did you do what you did when things were stressful? And that's when we start to get into the motivators, right? Our organization, Seth, our CEO, he puts it really funny. We're trying to make science fiction science fact. So there has to be this inherent humility that's present. There has to be this patient centricity that's present, and asking questions that really dive into the value-based motivators of why somebody did something. That's going to reveal all of the things that we need to know. Technical skills at a surface level are teachable. Values are not, especially in moments of stress. So we really are in the interview process focusing on when things weren't easy, when it wasn't, rainbows and unicorns. What did you do? How did you interact with the rest of your team? Because, again, like at the stage that we are in development, things are stressful. Things are fast. There is process where process is appropriate, but it's fluid. So you have to be nimble and comfortable with that level of ambiguity. And that's going to really push on just why you're in this industry or why you're at BlueRock. One thing that, and I'd like to just share a stat because I just shared it with my team, and I'm so excited about it because we've had this stood up for about a year. A year ago, we were about 300 headcount FTEs. Right now, we're about 430, 440. We had the exact same amount of terms, involuntary and voluntary, last Q1 as we did this Q1. So we've added 130 people and we have the same amount of terms because,
Wow.
When you scale, there's always the fear that you lose the inherent, well, this doesn't feel like BlueRock anymore, or we're changing, right? So the legacy people get a little uncomfortable. We've been able to protect that culture by interviewing against the values that made us who we are.
Wow, that's fascinating. So it's the exact same number of terms, but from a percentage standpoint, I don't know what the number is, but it's substantially lower. So
Yep.
that in itself is really interesting. You mentioned, you rattled off some of the values. For example, you said community is a value, right? So I guess, from my perspective, I'm trying to see how this scenario might play out on an interview panel. So, for example, you'll have the hiring manager really cover the ins and outs of the technicalities of the position.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll have another stakeholder, whether it's going to be a direct report or maybe another lead on the project, say, okay, you know what? You're going to exclusively focus your interview with this candidate around community. And then they will ask and probe for specific examples around community. Is that essentially how this process plays out?
So the only thing missing from your frame up, and this is something that I'm really, really proud of, is the hiring manager prepares the interviewers pre-interview for how this role would interact with them. So part of this whole interview process is a shared accountability model that talent acquisition, we don't hire people. We process manage the hiring process. The hiring manager hires people. So there's this shared accountability of
That's
building
right.
your team, right? How are you making sure that you have enough information after the debrief to make as informed of a decision as you possibly can? So it is the hiring manager's role here post intake meeting after we identify the interview team. Who makes the most sense to be on this interview team? How are you going to prepare them for things that they need to probe on as it relates to how their role will interact with this one? So take the community example. If we're going to assign the community value to somebody that is going to need to be very cross functionally tied to this role. And the things that they're going to hopefully frame up for the candidate is going to make that clear. But that line of questioning is really going to be about how do they work cross functionally and what frameworks do they need? What processes do they need in place to be successful working cross functionally? Because, one of the things that has allowed us to grow and be successful, in such a accelerated manner is how flat and cross-functional the organization is. So going into those conversations, having those interviewers prepared to really dive into that and drive into the why behind those questions is super, super important.
Wow, that's great. How did you come up with this? I mean, I'm sure you've, like you said, it's not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but you did add a lot of structure to it. And so, what made you want to add this level of structure and repeatability to your process?
So selfishly, it's about making the recruiters' lives easier.
Yeah,
But by doing that, it's making the hiring process easier. It's making the hiring managers' lives easier. It's creating a better candidate experience. So just by sharing the accountability of building the organization, everything gets more efficient, and there's far more accountability shared across that organization. One of the first things that I stood up at BlueRock was a referral program, but it was a referral program really kind of with a change management mindset disguised behind it. And we called it Always Be Recruiting, where if you have 3 recruiters, and that's how big the talent acquisition team was then, or you have 300 recruiters, who's going to have an organization that recruits more efficiently, right? So great talent, they get in-mails from recruiters, probably on the hour. They don't get in-mails from hiring managers, or they don't get pings from leaders in the industry. We changed that narrative where the first step in sourcing for us is sitting down with the hiring manager of, let's go through your network and you're going to message people, I'm not going to message people. And really kind of driving that mentality that if we are all recruiters and we're all stewards of the organization, if we have a structured process on the back end, it's going to be wildly efficient, and those folks are going to be far more invested.
how was that process received? I have I have to imagine there was some pushback involved,
So
right?
there was pushback, and
Yeah,
honestly, I think you have to, if you're going to be a head of TA anywhere, you have to have thick skin, right?
of
Because
course.
there are always folks that are used to what I call deli counter recruiting. They slide a requisition over the counter and say, tell me when it's ready.
Yeah,
When you're building anything, and the great thing about BlueRock is, that there really wasn't a quote unquote established way of doing things. So there was an appetite to try. And one of the things that I love here is there is that freedom to fail, right? So let's try it. If there's a good why behind it, and that why was giving us an opportunity to scale and providing a better candidate experience, we're going to give it a go. How you get that over the line is you wildly amplify the early adopters, right? Because there are the
Yeah.
folks that are like, sure, let's give it a shot. If they start to hire more efficiently than their peers, word of mouth is going to be a lot more effective than me telling them why they need to do it. So we focused heavily on the folks that wanted to give it a shot. And then with the support of leadership, because they also aligned with the why, that can't be underscored here. None of this would have been possible without true support from the executive committee.
Of course.
Once there's kind of that collective community leaning on the value,
Yeah.
it's easier for folks to say, okay, like, do we still have people like, well, I'd really rather have 3 people in the final interview process so I can pick my one? Sure, but you'll always have that. So it's being comfortable with incremental change and celebrating and amplifying the folks that are early adopters.
So when you look at this process, right, you're growing, your company's growing, but you're also trying to change things. When you look at where it was when you first got there versus where it's at now, for that particular example, right, it sounds like you made a lot of headway. But for that particular example, is it now a common, or we'll call it a fully established process for hiring managers to be reaching out to candidates? Or is there still some work to be done there? I mean, you had to develop a lot of process while being there, and it sounds like you've made quite an impact. But I'm kind of curious how that's going as you guys are growing.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of it does come down to the bandwidth of the hiring manager, the recruiter. The softness of the market now has changed things a little bit, right?
Sure.
Where 2 years ago, it was an absolute battle. And, now, again, I was looking at the Q1 numbers this year versus last. I had 3 times more applicants than we did last Q1.
Yeah.
We had, I think, an average of about 35 jobs open in Q1 of this year, and we had almost 8,000 applicants. So the need to source at the moment isn't as a burning need as it was, a year, 2 years ago. So, when we think about the process, the frameworks are consistent. So I don't want to build such a level of rigor that we can't be nimble, because again, that would be losing kind of who we are. But the
Of course.
general frameworks are organizationally accepted now. And if people have time to kind of dig into their network and do that kind of thing, fantastic. But the muscle within the organization enterprise wide of always be recruiting is there, that, and this sounds strange, but if I'm hiring somebody in toxicology, I might not ask the head of toxicology, who's the best toxicologist they know, because I hope it's them, right? I'm going to go over and talk to somebody in dev, somebody in tech ops, talk to me about some of the best toxicologists that you work with, and then we'll kind of go, that cross-functional route.
I like it. Really cool. Really thoughtful and also really logical. All right. So let's talk about, let's pivot a little bit and talk about after you've hired somebody, right? So the candidates had this process. They've had this very robust interview. They've talked more than about their resume. They've talked about their values. They've talked about certain experiences. They've aligned essentially with what that particular hiring team is looking for. Then there is the follow-up to that. So they have the offer out. I'm kind of curious, where does your process stop and what that post-hire engagement looks like?
No, absolutely. And I think this is probably where across the industry there's the most work to do, because it always gets clunky, right?
Yeah.
When does talent acquisition hand it off to HR business partners or the people team or the people ops team, or is there an onboarding team? And what does that look like? My role at BlueRock has changed to now kind of oversee all of quote unquote talent. So now that oversees acquisition, attraction, onboarding, and talent development. And I think it's a very natural progression that I tell my recruiters, I hope that the best relationship that they have coming into the organization is with them, right? They've had the most touch points, they've shared the most, they've been the most vulnerable. And if we've actually leaned in, like, there's a true connection there. Think about how disingenuous it is if, pre-offer, during the offer, we're all over them. We're texting them like, oh, we're so excited. We can't wait for you to be here. Like, this is fantastic. Congratulations. And then it's silent for the 3 weeks that they are going through one of the most stressful moments of anybody's life is leaving a job, right? You have
Yeah.
that, buyer's remorse after signing one, because then you have to go say goodbye to all your work friends and all that kind of stuff. Like, we have to stay engaged there. So one of the big changes that we have made is that, TA's job does not end at offer execution. That pre-boarding is such a pivotal time. It's setting up the hiring manager to start to think about the 30, 60, 90 for that person, to have that hiring manager start to engage with that oncoming employee, to get them prepared and start to build that relationship a little bit more. Because you think about it, that new employee has probably only spent an hour, two max with that hiring manager. So there's
Yeah.
going to be kind of a natural awkwardness there. So it's our role to kind of steward that relationship and make sure that it's as least awkward as it possibly can be in an inherently awkward situation. So, it's establishing a cadence of check-ins, making sure, like, you want to hop on a call after you resign, like, let's just talk about it. Like, let's be humans. And I think that's kind of what's lost sometimes post offer acceptance, is what's happening at a human level for somebody, while they're coming into the organization.
Yeah, you said something that just struck a chord with me, and that is the nature of interviewing in itself, and from a timing perspective, right? And you just said it. When you interview somebody, before you've actually made the decision to hire them, you've probably spent no more than 1.5, maybe 2 hours with them max. And I think 2 is probably
Probably pushing it.
extensive. Yeah.
Right.
So we'll call it an hour and a half. Other members of your team have spent time with them. But all in all, they've probably spent a total of maybe 5 to 6 hours with the team in general, and then specifically less time with the hiring manager. And then all of a sudden they're moving their entire career, and they're going to be working with this person 40 plus hours a week. And that's a really interesting piece about recruiting that I think often gets lost. And so I think the fact that you guys are conscious of that transition is pretty unique. And so I'd be curious about some specific examples, right? So, like, what does that, like, would you guys go as far as to help somebody walk through a resignation? Or is it more so just checking in, staying in touch, seeing how they're doing, sharing up? Do you guys have like a laid out process, or is it more just kind of like a broad nurturing that you like to do?
Yeah, honestly, so this is something that I don't want to over engineer. I want it to be able to be flexible to the unique situations that we're going to come across. So, we've walked folks through how to resign. We've, we've found out from recruiter or from candidates when they were going to resign, and we called them right after just to console them, because we knew there was going to be, an emotionally charged conversation. We've prepared folks for counter offers and what they were going to do, and reminding them about the why. And, like, it's really easy to forget that new company that you were excited about 5 days ago when you signed the offer, but then, like, the flood of emotions comes in of, like, the things that you like about your current job. So being engaged there, and not just being engaged to make sure that the person doesn't renege on the offer, like, that's transactional. That's not what we're going for here. We're going for, again, that human relationship of, like, you're going through something right now. We want to be there for you. And if you're silent after that, it's so disingenuous. Like, there are people that will share things about, their kids, their life, their dogs. Like, well, who's going to walk your dog now? Like, how do we figure that out? Great. Like,
Yeah.
well, we have a community here. We can, see if anybody has recommendations for dog walkers, or, little things like that. But it puts such a human touch on the pre-boarding, where we want it to be as least stressful as it possibly can. And we push candidates to take a week off in between jobs, if at all possible, because we want them to take that deep breath and be recharged before jumping into BlueRock. So it's something that we push pretty hard on.
Yeah.
It catches some candidates off guard a little bit, because a lot of hiring managers, And this is where we have kind of that business partner relationship where we have the freedom to push back, because every hiring manager in every company would say, like, when can they start? Tomorrow.
Of
Like,
course.
get them in here. But
Yesterday.
if you're going to get the best version of that new hire, you want them to have closure with their previous company. You want them to have time to recharge and really get excited about coming on here. And then you're going to get the best version of them. So we own kind of the opportunity to shape that first kind of onboarding experience. And we have to take that really seriously.
As you're speaking, you're saying a lot of things that are really familiar to me. And, I think also what you're saying sounds like the way a good recruiting agency or a good search firm would operate, by just not being overly transactional when it comes to placing their candidate. But it sounds like you guys actually take on a lot of that on your own, which is refreshing. And I don't know. I'm sure that happens at other places. I'm actually positive it does, but I'm not sure that it's the norm. And I'm also not sure that enforcing or really pushing all week off in between gigs is the norm either. I personally see a huge value in that, right? Like you said, person resigns, their last day is on a Thursday or Friday, and the next Monday, they're totally shifting their mindset into a new organization with a new group of people. That could be a lot. That could be a lot. So I think that's
Sure.
really intelligent and empathetic for you guys to take that approach.
The one thing that I would be remiss if we didn't bring up is, what about the folks that don't get the offer, right? So the folks that got into process. And I think just because of bandwidth, it's really easy for that relationship to be transactional of
Yeah.
like, hey, like, if you hear from the recruiter like that you didn't get the job, like, hey, sorry you didn't get the job, and then the end. Like, why does the relationship have to end there? So what we have done in our new applicant, we use Lever as an applicant tracking system, and they have a feature called Nurture. So if a person doesn't get the role, we offer them the opportunity to go into our pipeline. And what we do is we send out, quarterly updates of things that are happening at BlueRock, and then open roles. Like, I want the candidate experience to be so impactful that if they don't get a role here, they want to get a role here still, and they're going to
Yeah.
be a external ambassador of the organization, but they're going to stay with us. We've seen so many more repeat applicants in the past 2 years, just because, like, that's saying a testament that, wow, like, that process meant something. They can tell there's a differentiation here. And again, it comes down to just the human component. You go on LinkedIn right now, and everybody, like, it's trendy to talk about how bad recruiters are, but
Yeah.
there's still ones out there that, if they're there for the right reasons and they're in the job for the right reasons, as a true talent broker, the human component is not going to be lost there.
I couldn't agree more. I'm actually curious to hear. And by the way, what you just said is something that I think a lot of the best recruiters that I know do, right? Even if they're on the agency side, they're still going to follow up. They're going to deliver thorough feedback, and they're going to make sure that just because that candidate didn't get the position for that particular job, that doesn't mean the relationship's over. But I guess coming from your side, right? Coming from the corporate or the TA side of things, has there been instances where you've interviewed a candidate, or rather your team has interviewed a candidate, and the candidate was good, right? They were a good candidate. They fit a lot of the values, but for whatever reason, there was another candidate that was a better fit. Has there ever been an instance or instances where you guys have actually gone back and revisited that candidate, and it's been an easier recruit and to actually hire them? Has that happened? Because it seems like that could be a really good benefit of making sure their experience was good, because now you have done a lot of work on the front end to re-recruit that candidate and place them within the organization. Does that happen? Has that happened?
Absolutely. And, I attribute that there's something, and I think every recruiter has it. It's recruiter recall, right? You're opening up a rec 2 months later, and you're like, oh, I have the perfect person for that. And if you go back to the well there and they had a great experience, like, fantastic. I think where this ties back to it, kind of full circle in the conversation here, if you don't have thorough, robust notes from the interview, it's going to be really difficult to identify if that person's going to be a fit for the next role coming down the pipe. And when you have really subjective, unstructured interview conversations, you're not going to have those notes. So having, those structured interviews it's easier to make those ties where, in a note section, when you're dispositioning somebody, like, let's put a tag on them in the applicant tracking system that, they might be good for XYZ. So now if we go back to the well, because if you're starting a search anywhere outside of your past applicants in the applicant tracking system, you're making life too hard on yourself. But
That's
your
right.
data is, it's only going to be as good as the integrity of your data. So really, like, putting the onus on your recruiters that they have to be diligent when dispositioning folks and capturing the notes, because they're just going to be making their lives easier if they do that in the future.
Mike, a lot of the stuff you're saying sounds like it's right out of a recruiting agency playbook.
Don't tell anybody.
But it sounds really familiar, and it's a lot of things you're saying is the way that I've lived my life, and that I've kind of taught and mentored people to live their life from a recruiting perspective. How much of that do you think you've taken from industry, or sorry, from agency? Because I know you spent some time in agency. How much of that have you, I guess, taken from the corporate side, or how much of it is just pure logic from your perspective?
So I think it's a mix. I think it's so funny, and I don't understand it, but there's, like, this inherent rivalry of internal TA versus agency. Like, sorry, like, agencies exist because it works. So, the process works. So why not take a lot of those fundamentals and tie it back to internal? Like,
Of course.
internal TA in a lot of places is transactional, and it can fundamentally change the organization if it's not.
Yeah, fascinating, but also logical, right? Like agencies wouldn't be in existence if they weren't effective. And I think a lot of the best, not to say all of the best, but I think a lot of the best recruiters and TA people that I've ever worked with who are in positions like yourself did spend time at an agency. And it was usually a significant amount of time, not always, but it was at least a couple years. So
So, not that I have a kind of hard line when recruiting recruiters, but there is definitely a preference to have folks that have spent time in agency, because they understand the urgency. They understand that, you know, the job is filling roles. And really, I think where you balance that internally for me, and this is kind of the mentoring that happens after bringing somebody directly from agency, is that I would rather have a role unfilled if we were going to fill it with the wrong person. So is filling the role important? Yes, but filling the role with the right person is the only thing that we're focused on.
yeah,
So having the person that has the raw skills to be able to kind of balance the salesmanship component with the internal knowledge and the embedded presence with the business, like, that's a dangerous recruiter.
yeah. I mean, geez, your perspective is great. Like, I really appreciate it. Um, this conversation has been different than some of the other conversations I've had, and I think your approach,
Good different, or bad different?
no, great different. And I do think, one of the reasons that I started this podcast was to, give something back out to the TA community to help other TA leaders like yourself to be able to hear successes and failures of their peers. And I can genuinely say that I think this conversation is going to be very valuable for other TA leaders and some of your peers in the industry. And hopefully, you're not giving them too much of a competitive advantage or giving yourself a competitive disadvantage by sharing this information. But I think it's generous of you to have shared this information. And I can truly say I think it's very effective, and it clearly has been effective, and you have the data and some of the numbers to support it. And so you should be proud of that.
No, I really appreciate that. And, I hope that it's a pay it forward moment, because I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for just tremendous mentors and folks that you just sponge knowledge off of. So, if this helps folks, that are questioning whether or not this is a job for them, which is typically every Friday afternoon for a recruiter, happy to help.
Yeah, no, that's right. I feel that almost everything I've learned in this industry has been from people that had more experience than me, or were better than me, or were generous enough to share their experience with me. In addition to trial and error, right? So that's I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't have great people around me to share their knowledge. So it's much appreciated.
No, absolutely. And I can tell you, there's been a plethora of failures that we didn't talk about on this conversation today.
Of course. We could certainly have a whole other session about that. And you know what? I think we will. We'll schedule something for, a month or so out. Sorry, a year or so out. And we'll talk about our failures, because those are just as important as successes.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Mike, great having you as a guest here. And thank you for all your time and insight.
No, absolutely. Appreciate it, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Talent Therapy Podcast with Chris Tamburini. This show is for entertainment purposes only and is copywritten by Rana and Vance, LLC.